Jazz. Jazz is a very unique form of music. One definition cannot describe jazz, as it is constantly evolving. Developed by African Americans and influenced by European harmonic and African rhythms, it dominated the United States in the 20th century. Jazz is known for its improvisation, syncopated rhythm, and polyphonic ensemble plan. Jazz is also never composed entirely, and each performance of a piece is always different. So where does this special form of music begin? During the 18th century, a large group of African Americans were being transported to the New World to become slaves, to pick crops such as cotton or tobacco, for little or no pay. In New Orleans during the 19th century, these slaves brought over their traditions of music to pass the time. Their music consisted of a one-line melody called a call and response pattern. Unlike traditional music, this type of music was counter-metric, which meant it was played or sung on an offbeat. In modern music, this term is now referred to as syncopation. These African Americans later created instruments from bones such as washboards, jugs, and a drum. Later on, these early jazz melodies would be influenced by church hymns, which would introduce heterophony, a variation of single-line melodies and counterparts, which paved the way for blues. With all these influences, jazz ultimately evolved into a distinct musical style and language composed of many different elements, including the field hollers of the cotton plantations, the work songs of the railroads, rivers and levees, hymns and spirituals, popular dance music, the long-standing banjo performing tradition, which culminated half a century later in the banjo's enormous popularity, with a European opera, theater, concert music, and of course, the blues and ragtime. The abolishment of slavery granted the U.S. with a surplus of educated African Americans and gave them opportunities in the entertainment industry. During this time, many black musicians were classically trained, but were unable to find employment in the classical music. As a result, many of them turned to a new form of music. This introduced yet another new rhythm to early jazz, called ragtime. Ragtime was a slight adjustment to the march of John Philip Sousa, which added polyrhythms from African music. This ragtime rhythm was normally written in 2/4 or 4/4 time, with the left hand containing a predominant pattern in the bass on the strong beats of 1 and 3, and chords on weaker beats such as 2 and 4, with an offbeat or syncopated melody. During these times, blues was just in its earliest form, being introduced around 1860 in the Deep South. Blues was heavily influenced by traditional African music and African American work songs. Additionally, blues incorporated shouts, spirituals, and created simple ballads. Blues later developed to become more sophisticated. From simple chord progressions, blues had specific chord progressions, such as a 12-bar chord progression, and notes that extended to the fourth harmony, such as 5th, 7th, 9th, and a repetitive trance-like rhythm in the bass called groove. Some people may lump all ragtime and jazz together, but there are many differences between the two. Ragtime was a thoroughly composed piece of music which was intended to be played in the same manner each time. Further, most ragtime music was written for the piano. Ragtime for other instruments was extremely rare, which was very different from jazz. Finally, ragtime had a strict form and strict tempo, whereas jazz was more loose. As more ragtime players experimented with improvisations on their pieces, some drifted into jazz. Jelly Roll Morton was among the musicians that drifted from ragtime to jazz. He was a pianist and composer who claimed to be the inventor of jazz. This may not be entirely true, but his influence on the genre is still significant. In 1902, Morton played ragtime in the red light district of Storyville, New Orleans, the center of all New Orleans music at the time. Being a composer, he assimilated the matrix and created compositions of jazz. Others, such as saxophonist Sidney Betch, trombonist Kid Ory, and cornist Bunk Johnson and Freddie Kepper, also were able to create new style music. As a result, a new style called New Orleans jazz was created. What preceded this New Orleans jazz was a mix of traditional African American music and some music from Europe, Afro-Latin music. This rhythm was a 3-stroke pattern, which meant it ran on a rhythmic duple pulse, called tresillo. This 3-stroke pattern was eventually adopted in the background of some New Orleans jazz. Between 1910 and 1915, New Orleans musicians emphasized independence, but harmonically linked in simultaneous lines. Each instrument was assigned a clear role in the polyphonic ensemble. For example, The cornet was responsible for stating the thematic line, while the trombone offered contrapunto asides in the tenor or baritone range. This style became the concept of New Orleans jazz. Soon, a young trumpet player named Louis Armstrong would emerge from this New Orleans jazz style.
However, in 1917, Storyville was closed down. Many musicians went to play in Mississippi Riverboat orchestras, while others headed north to Chicago, which ended up being the new center of jazz of the United States. King Oliver, a famous cornet of New Orleans, migrated to Chicago in 1918 and 4 years later asked a student, Louis Armstrong, to join the Creole Jazz Band as a second cornetist. The two astounded the audience with duet breaks. Armstrong also had the opportunity to freely improvise melodic counterpoints to Oliver's lead cornet. In late 1924, Armstrong decided to move to New York City to work with Fletcher Henderson. There, he matured into a major soloist and developed a defining rhythmic part of jazz, swing. One early example of this rhythmic inflection can be heard in Armstrong's Hot 5 and Hot 7 recordings. Not only was he influential, Armstrong could be considered the first superstar of jazz. Through recordings and in theaters, he spread jazz to all parts of America. His playing was both technically and conceptually many levels above his peers. He not only influenced trumpet players, but also trombonists, saxophonists, singers, and even pianists. Now let's get back to Fletcher Henderson in New York. He was the first person to perform and record orchestral jazz. Orchestral jazz was different in that it included a larger variety of instruments and was thoroughly composed instead of improvisational. Another prominent figure in orchestral jazz was Duke Ellington. Ellington blended thematic material from his players with his own compositions. Ellington had the opportunity to explore several categories of composition, including music for the club, dance numbers, arrangements of pop tunes, and independent non-functional instrumental compositions. The most celebrated of these was Mood Indigo, the first of the many pieces with a blues-like character. Further, Ellington was able to extend and vary the forms of jazz. In early works, Ellington experimented with new mutes and the bathroom plunger. He also created unusual blends between brass and reeds. In addition, Ellington's genius for harmonic invention, using the outer extensions of basic triad and dominant seventh chords, led him to use bitonality and polytonality before everyone else. Despite all of Ellington's work, he did not have much impact on the jazz genre in general. In the 1930s, the world was racially divided and white bands such as the Casa Loma and Benny Goodman orchestras were much more popular than black bands of Ellington, Benny Moten, and others. Further, Ellington's music was considered formally and harmonically too challenging for the average 1930s swing fan. Ellington did not get to be known until the 1960s, where his orchestra made lengthy annual tours all over the world with popular successes like Satin Doll. In the 1920s, other groups were having success. Jelly Roll Morton's Red Hot Peppers, Paul Whiteman's orchestra, and White McKinney's Cotton Pickers had been thriving. The Red Hot Peppers blended late ragtime with the new developing improvisational skill. Morton gathered veteran New Orleans jazz musicians and carefully planned each of the players' solos. As a result, Morton achieved an almost perfect balance of ensemble and solo, and the improvisations and compositions enhanced one another. Integrating solos into arrangements will not be done in jazz for decades. By balancing compositional unity with a textual and timbral variety, and by reconciling composition and improvisation as well as polyphonic and homophonic ensembles, Morton pointed a way towards the future of jazz. All these orchestral jazz bands demonstrated that jazz was completely compatible with composition, not just arrangement. Benny Moten's band and their recordings were a breakthrough in orchestral jazz and are considered a precursor of modern jazz. This was because of their driving rhythmic energy, technical virtuosity, and good soloists. Like previous black bands, Moten was unable to make a big impact on the greater jazz scene. The White Casa Loma band also had a great influence on other bands, including new swing orchestras such as Benny Goodman's band. Casa Loma was notable because they were the first white orchestra to try to swing. The next breakthrough in jazz was Goodman's band in 1935, when his band suddenly became a huge hit. This marked the start of the swing era, and Goodman was hailed as the king of swing, although ironically black bands have been swinging for years, such as Ellington and Henderson. Soon, music with antiphonal sections, a juxtaposition of solo and ensembles, and riff-based tunes became extremely common and even standard. Count Basie's band became the next big thing in swing, with a lot of improvised solos and increased looseness in ensemble playing. Unfortunately, arrangers and composers were often overlooked by jazz fans in favor of orchestra and band leaders, who were the face of the band. Notable composers and arrangers included Cy Oliver, Mary Lou Williams, and Fletcher Henderson. Major swing soloists also became prominent in the 1930s, including tenor saxophonist Coleman Hawkins, Teddy Wilson, and singer Billie Holiday.
In the late 1930s, there was a shift back to smaller groups in combos, in response to the big bands that had taken over in the 1930s. Notable combos included the Goodman-led combos and Nat King Cole's trio. Important recordings from these groups include Body and Soul and Avalon by Goodman, and Straighten Up and Fly Right and Route 66 by Nat King Cole. The success of Goodman combos also led to the idea of creating a small combo from a larger orchestra, called a band within a band. Many now famous soloists also emerged during this time, such as Dizzy Gillespie, Charlie Parker, and Jimmy Blanton. Jazz harmony also started to evolve more, with arrangers starting to use more 9th, 11th, and 13th chords, following what Ellington had done earlier. Bebop started to develop in the 1940s, and this marked the beginning of modern jazz. Charlie Parker was the leading figure in bebop music, along with Dizzy Gillespie, Thelonious Monk, and Miles Davis. They reshaped jazz harmonically, melodically, and rhythmically. Parker revolutionized jazz by turning 4/4 into 8/8, making the music seem twice as fast. Characteristics of bebop include more chromaticism in its melodic lines, fast tempos, and many chord substitutions and new harmonies. Bebop was played by small combos and was meant for listening, not dancing. However, bebop was extremely controversial at the time. The jazz audience was split into 3 camps: those who still stuck to swing, those who shifted to listening to jazz solo singers, and a small minority who listened to bebop. Thelonious Monk was the next major jazz composer after Morton and Ellington, utilizing his unorthodox piano technique and unusual voicing and chords. At the same time that bebop was starting to be developed, cool jazz also emerged during the 1940s. It was characterized by contrapuntal and harmonically slimmed down chamber groups and a more relaxed and understated playing style. The emergence of cool jazz was pioneered by reed players such as Lee Konitz and Jerry Mulligan. The well-known modern jazz quartet was founded in 1953, and pianist John Lewis, inspired by classical music, particularly that of J.S. Bach, incorporated a contrapuntal composition and playing style to the group. Also during the 1950s, jazz players began increasingly studying classical composers and styles, increasing reconciliation and connections between classical and jazz players. Because of this, a style of jazz called third-stream jazz appeared. A similar phenomenon happened earlier when classical composers borrowed elements from jazz music. But now, jazz composers and players were borrowing from their classical counterparts, representing a thorough fusion of multiple musical styles. Robert Gratinger has made many important contributions to third stream, such as his atonal and polyphonic composition, City of Glass. Meanwhile, mainstream jazz continued to expand, mainly influenced by Miles Davis and John Coltrane. Coltrane eventually shifted away from the complex harmonic language of bop and switched to modal and single chord confinement, performing extended improvisations, often almost an hour long, that some listeners called practice in public. In the late 1950s, Davis switched to a more lyrical style because he realized that he could not match up against Gillespie's technique. Jazz shifted to a more modal style of playing that did not allow for any harmonic progression or sense of forward movement, making music sound structurally stagnant. In the 1950s, after World War II, saxophonist Ornette Coleman pioneered what is termed free jazz, a radical break from traditional jazz forms and disregarding conventional key signatures, time signatures, and jazz styles. However, free jazz also incorporated elements of much older folk-like blues, such as traditional soulful blues sounds and unconventional intonation. By the 1970s and 80s, no unique artist had entered the scene, and jazz during this time became relatively stagnant. At the end of the 20th century, personal unique characteristics of jazz figures were replaced with technical prowess and stylistic flexibility. Young players sounded very similar to one another, but were also able to play a wider range of styles and genres, partly because of the increased number of players who went to music schools and conservatories. The number of jazz recordings also exploded. Jazz continues to evolve and remains a distinctive musical genre that has manifested itself in many new genres of music, such as hip-hop, lo-fi, R&B, and Mario Kart music.